King Charles I, the man, the myth, the legend, but most importantly, the absolute monarch. During the 1630s, his apparent determination to rule England without the assistance of Parliament and his support for high church religious practices aroused considerable alarm among Parliament. The more zealous Protestants or Puritans came to fear that Charles was pursuing a hidden agenda, that he planned to remove his people's rights or liberties and to restore England to the Catholic fold. These fears instilled an idea in Parliament and others that would be the beginning of a civil war that could only be ended with violence. In 1637, Charles attempted to introduce a new form of prayer book in his northern kingdom of Scotland, but a major rebellion erupted, and the king did not have enough money to raise an army in order to quell the rebellion, and was forced to summon a parliament. Yet the men who assembled at Westminster were unwilling to give the king the money he needed until their own grievances had been dealt with. They wrote a document titled the Petition of Right, and this document stated all the grievances that Parliament had with Charles I. Now, Charles was forced to sign this document because he needed the money, and when he did, it limited the power of the monarch and challenged the ideas of divine right and absolute monarchy. It said that even the king was subject to the law, and could not do whatever he wished without limits. Now, King Charles quickly disregarded the petition which he had signed and returned to protecting England as an absolute monarch. But when Charles disregarded the Petition of Right after signing it, Parliament no longer cared for the king's way of ruling, and Parliament and many Puritans felt as though the king's ideals and his religious ideas were not in the favor of the country, so they banded together to create the Roundheads in order to purge the kingdom of King Charles I, and they began with taking control of the country. Now, the more noble men of the country banded together to protect the king and his ideals at all cost. These courageous men were known as the Cavaliers. These men were fighting to protect the established social order, since keeping Charles in office would keep the social order intact. They were fighting because they felt as though they needed to fight for the king for their honor, and because he had served them for so many years. And at the center of it all was a split in the religious ideas of each group. Most people supporting Parliament believed that we should have a more pure religion. But the Cavaliers, who supported the king, believed in the true religion. The Cavaliers believed in the Anglican Church, which was free of all of the Puritan zeal that was poisoning Christianity. But as time went by, religious traditionalists who followed the Anglican Church became increasingly alienated as the more radical Puritan religions spread through England. These traditionalists turned to Charles for support, and with all these people turning to Charles, it gave him a large amount of power, and he made a bold attempt to seize back the political initiative. And when Charles strode into the Parliament House with a body of soldiers and demanded the persons of 5 members of Parliament who he declared betrayed, everything went wrong. The men escaped, and since no sovereign had ever entered the House of Commons, especially with the intent to arrest a member of Parliament, this destroyed the Cavaliers' efforts to portray him as a defense against innovation and order. And soon, London went into chaos on what Charles had done, and was soon taken over by Parliament on January 10th, 1642. And Charles was forced to flee. But now, war was inevitable. In the beginning of the war, there were small skirmishes, but the first battle was the Battle of Edgehill on October 23rd, 1642. This first battle ended inconclusively, though, as both sides were left with large amounts of damage done to their ranks. And from 1642 until 1644, these types of battles kept occurring. But it did seem as though the Royalists were winning. But in late 1644, when Parliament forces won the Battle of Marston Moor, the war tipped in the favor of Parliament. And in June 1646, the king's wartime capital, Oxford, was surrendered to the Parliamentarian New Model Army, and Charles fled in disguise and put himself under the protection of the Scots. But they soon handed him back to Parliament, and 2 years later, the king was led to the executioner's block. On January 30th, 1649, the king was beheaded, and with the death of the king came the death of the English Civil War. But the memory of the king would live on